largest gathering of church planting leaders in North America each year, and possibly the world. The conference is held in Orlando, Florida each April. Visit exponentialconference.com for more information. We hope you enjoy this workshop.
All right, let's get started. My name's Larry McCrary, and we're going to try to do this tag team, but we have one microphone, and so we'll have to share, so we'll have to make sure I don't run off. But we will try to tag team this thing this afternoon, and thanks for coming in. And we're going to just take a look, because we're definitely not experts, and we're just going to take a look at what are some missionary skills that we feel are important as you start planting a church, here in the North American context. How many of you guys are involved in a church planter right now? Okay. That's a lot of this conference. So here we go. So I think, I started churches here in the States during the big 90s. And we were very honed in on having a really cool band and good drama and good video and quality child care and quality preaching. Well, except for that part for me. But anyway, we were very focused on planting church services, actually. And I became quite proficient at planting church services. There's one issue with that, pretty major one, was when, Jesus gave us the Great Commission. Didn't really talk about church services. It said go out and do what? Make disciples. And I think for me, that hit me somewhere around year 4 of my time in Europe. We planted churches during the 90s, like I said, here in the States, and part of 8 different church plants. Then we moved to Madrid, Spain. And I guess it took me a while to probably deconstruct some things. One of the things for me, actually, was that where I planted churches here in the States, I really could get by with having those things and attracting a lot of people. But I found in a post-Christian society, you cannot make the assumption that people are actually looking to go to church or that they're shopping around or they have that interest. And so how do you go in and how do you start engaging a community then? As a church planter, the way that I was kind of brought up looked very differently than what could work in for us in Europe. And so instead of planting church services, I should have been about planting the gospel, and making disciples, and then out of that, I believe, churches emerge and they start growing up around that. The church reproduces itself. The church is appropriate to the context of the community in which it's being started, and it effectively ministers within that community. So I think today in the United States that church planting really requires missionary thinking. And the days are gone by where you can simply develop a brand or in a venue, send out mailers, and invite people to come. So I believe we can learn from missionaries. And hopefully today this will be a good dialogue, a good presentation about what are some missionary skills that can really help you as you plant churches here. And so Caleb and I are going to tag team. And Caleb, tell me a little bit about your context in Portland. We'll get started.
My name is Caleb Cryder, and I am a church planter in Portland, Oregon. I say church planter because I've just taken this on. It's been just a couple of months now since we got started. We have 25 people meet in my living room, and it's we have no idea what we're doing. But and some of you are like, yeah, that's us too, so we can relate. But I'm new at this. But I've been trained. Here's the thing. Early on, I felt called to ministry. Didn't know what that meant. Ended up going into full-time missions. Served as church planting strategist in Spain for several years. We were there 2000 to about 7 years. And through that process, I got missionary training. Now, some of you know what that is, right? Some of you aren't sure. Missionary training is a certain it's an education that we reserve for those people who have committed to going overseas and doing ministry, right? So it's a whole bunch of stuff, and it's kind of basic, but it's actually very good. It's well thought out. Theologians and missiologists for years have put together basic concepts, mostly things that have been observed, right? So this isn't somebody sitting around in an office dreaming up ideas. It's we see God tends to work in certain ways as His people, as His church crosses culture to plant the gospel in different contexts, right? So we see this, we take this out, and we kind of have these principles, if you will. The problem is church planters in the States don't get that training. For some reason, we think, well, you're in America, so you should think like this corporate executive who plants a church that's going to look like whatever other church we want to hold up as a model. And that's a bad start. So I found this weird when I came back to the States. My family moved back about almost 4 years ago now. There was this weird dissonance where I was talking about being a church planter overseas, and some friends were talking about being church planters here in America, and we were not saying the same thing. Not that my way is right, somebody else's way is wrong, but I just noticed there's a difference. And so I've tried to pour myself into, okay, I'm getting ready to start this thing in my home. What do? God's doing something. So I've looked for training, right? Just like you all. How do you get an idea of where to get started? What should I be focusing on? My priorities, all these things. It's kind of fuzzy. But I'm thankful for my missionary training. And it's given us a sense of purpose and direction and some great ideas for where to get started. And so when we decided we heard we were coming here, we wanted to share that with church planters that are in the same boat. Some basic missionary training, right? So we brought 3 basic missionary principles or ideas that we want to give to you today. These are not original to us, okay? We do not own these. These are almost common knowledge if you had the secret password and handshake into the missions world, which some of you have, some of you don't. We'll give it to you today, okay? So 3 concepts, and so just these things will help you begin to think and act like missionaries. There are a lot more ideas. These are not the only 3, right? So the first thing would be mapping. Mapping. Now, any missionary anywhere, when he first gets started, is an outsider, and he recognizes that. He's a foreigner. So when we first got to Spain, we had no idea what we were doing, anything about the place. We landed in a big city, had no idea what we were doing. So the first thing we did was walk the streets, right? That's actually not what you hear a lot of times when you start planting churches in the States. Most church planters begin to plant a church, well, in their mind, but by sitting in an office in front of a computer. We start with a name and a cool logo. Not a good place to start planting a church, right? Missionaries know that you start by mapping. So mapping was demonstrated to me when I was first kind of pursuing my call to mission. A missionary who had served in the Middle East called me into his home, to his apartment. So my wife and I go over for dinner, and we sit down in his living room. And right in the middle, like, they didn't have the TV. The living room was not arranged around a television like it is in other houses. It was actually a map of the world. A map of the Middle East where this man was living. And what he had done was he had begun to plot on the map places where he saw God at work. He had pins and notes and sticky tape and like string. If I didn't know better, I'd think the guy's like a serial killer, right? You've seen those movies, right? Like the serial killer always has like a map with string attaching with photos. I don't know, his victims. This guy, though, had a map of God's activity in the place where he was serving. That's where he began his ministry. He prayed over that map. And as soon as I sat down, he could tell me, outline his ministry for me by pointing to places on the map. It was awesome. So I was like, that's really cool. I got to learn how to do that. So mapping became an integral part, the very first step of our ministry. Again, mapping, not original to us, but I want to share you some. Mapping tends to look at 3 layers. Right? For mission, for those of us planting churches on mission, we look at 3 layers. The first layer is the geographic or the spatial layer. So it's like in space, like the geography of the lay of the land, if you will. Right? So the spatial or the geography layer. The second one is, the social layer. Who lives there? The demographics, those kinds of things, right? And the third is the spiritual. The third is the spiritual layer. Okay, so I know if you're taking notes, then maybe you can figure out how to make sense of this. The geography is really easy, but it's the one we tend to skip a lot of times. Because we think I just fire up Google Maps and I'm good, right? But it doesn't actually, there's a little bit more required than that. So let's see if we can pull up a map. Let's see if it'll work for us. It will. This is my neighborhood in Portland, Oregon. We spend a lot of time walking around in our streets because people in our neighborhood walk. They walk and they ride their bikes. In your neighborhood, it might be that people drive a lot, so maybe you should do that, drive a lot. But we've gotten to know our neighborhood. Now, one guiding principle for us for mapping has been Lynch in 1970 Kevin Lynch wrote a book called The Image of the City. And in that book, the idea was that urban dwellers, people who live in cities, organize their space. They understand their city according to 5 elements. And so for us, we're like, oh, we're gonna map those 5 elements. So that's where we started. The first element is paths. So a path is any route that somebody travels in a city. So like this is Lombard Street. It's like a major thoroughfare through our neighborhood. It's 4 lanes in each direction. There are bike lanes. All the buses travel on that. It's like a major artery of traffic. So it's a path that people take. And what Lynch said is brilliant. The path is actually, it determines a person's understanding of the city. So because they travel along the path, like every day, this is my house, by the way. Don't like come visit me unannounced. I live here. If people travel along this path all the time, so what they're understanding, their perspective of this neighborhood is what they see from the sidewalk or the bike path or the street, right there. So that's their understanding of. So that shapes it. It's basic. If you want to put yourself in the shoes of the people to whom you're ministering, walk along the same paths that they travel, because then you'll see the city they see. So it's interesting because sometimes if people decide, you know what, I'm not going to take that street, I'm going to come down here on Rosa Parks, right? It gets me in the same place. It's parallel paths, but it's a different path altogether. The person who travels this path has a different perspective of the city than the person who travels on this path. So a big part of me being a missionary to my neighborhood is traveling on the paths, right? And not just traveling along the paths, but also in the same mode of transportation. Because I can tell you right now that Lombard Street on a bus, it takes forever. Forever. It stops like at every one of these intersections. So on the bus, this is a very long street. But if you were to hop in the car, it takes you like 3 minutes to get all the way down Lombard. Same path, different perspective according to your mode of travel, right? So mapping, the first element would be to look at their paths. How do people get around? So paths are the first element, and so we map that. So we would draw on our map. We'd be like, that's a major path, and we would say, everybody goes up and down this path. We'd actually kind of make it even broader. It's like this is a very heavily traveled path. Okay. So the next element, according to Lynch, is nodes. Nodes are places where paths converge, right? These are strategic points for us as church planters to think about. So this is Interstate Avenue, right? Interstate Avenue used to be the interstate. It used to be the only way to get from Portland up to Seattle before they put in the Interstate 5. And that just ruined everything, right? So the neighborhood now doesn't know what to do. And it's kind of like the really sad story of all the cool businesses on interstate had to go out of business because now there's the freeway cutting through town. But nevertheless, for my neighborhood, Interstate Avenue is significant, right? It is still sort of the place where everything's kind of broken down, but it's still definitely a major path. Well, I've got 2 major paths in my neighborhood, so I would say that this intersection of these 2 streets is a node. And it really is in lots of ways. It's not just the traffic traveling this way and the traffic traveling this way. It's also because that's where all the bus stops are. And when you change from one bus line to another, that's where you do it. That's where people are constantly coming and going. So it's a node of activity. Nodes are significant because that's where you have the most eyes. Advertising. Advertisers know this. That's why they always buy space on a node, right? So like anything can be a node, a bus station, a train station, a plaza in the middle of town, right? Those kind of places where paths converge, that's valuable real estate. That's also why some of you guys, when you're passing out flyers, you go to a node to pass out flyers. Why? Because you have the most eyes on you, right? So nodes are significant, and we map those because we know, well, that's where there's a lot of people. And it's funny because in a node, people behave differently than they do on their paths. When they're on their path, they're walking along. This is my neighborhood. I walk this path every day. So they kind of know what they're doing. They're in their element. But as soon as they enter into a node, they're starting to interact with, or their paths are converging with people that they don't know very well, people who are different from them, right? So they hold their purses a little tighter, right? They watch their back a little bit more. They kind of brace themselves against strangers and strangeness and difference. So it's interesting. If you're going to interact with somebody, you're going to walk up to somebody. This is your key strategy for church planting. You're going to walk up to a stranger and talk to them. Where should you do it? A path or a node?
On a path.
On a path. If you're on a path and you're familiar with the path, now we've got this in common. But if I'm walking up to strangers just because I have the most eyes, the most access to people, but they're on their guard, is that going to make a difference? Absolutely. Absolutely. So mapping, again, let's look at the next element. We have paths, we have nodes. Next we have districts, right? Districts are those areas of a town that have internal perceived sameness. And all that is to say that it's basically an area that's like a neighborhood, a district. This is this area, and it's different from another area. In some towns, you have housing additions. That would be a district. A district is where you say, when I live here, when I'm physically in this space, it means something. It has the same architecture, the same feel, the same vibe. But then I'll go to another neighborhood. It has a different feel, a different vibe, right? Neighborhoods are important. Districts are important because that's where urban dwellers get their sense of identity. If you say to an urban dweller, where do you live? They won't say, if you say to somebody in Portland, where do you live? They won't say Portland. They'll tell you their neighborhood, the quadrant, the section of town, the district. So that's super important because a lot of times we go, I'm in, this is my neighborhood right here, but we don't recognize that actually my neighborhood ends and another neighborhood begins there. So it's about our identity. And every neighborhood, every district has the fifth element of the city, which are edges. So when one neighborhood ends and another neighborhood begins, that's an edge. This is significant for us as church planters, and here's why. We think, if I put my church really close to here, then I have this reach, this radius of reach that people can come to my church from this whole area, right? The problem is edges tell us that proximity does not equal similarity. So there are people that can live here that's just literally feet from here, but because it's across an edge, they have nothing in common. Two totally different districts. An edge is anything where you move from one neighborhood to another. Usually it's at a place like a busy street. When they put in the freeway, that was a hard edge. You can't cross the freeway except for a few places. So nobody does. So people who were once neighbors now live in different districts and don't know each other, never cross paths. So when you plant your church and you're thinking, we're going to be centrally located, that might not even be a thing. Just because you're in the middle of the town doesn't mean that you're accessible to the people that you think you're accessible to. And you guys know what this is like. You have those places in town that you visit frequently, those places that you're familiar with. If we were to take all of them and put them together, your city isn't as big as you think it is, right? So the places you shop, the places you work, the places you live, if you put that all together, that's really your city. And if you start to do that, put yourself in the shoes of the people that live in your city, you might approach some of the things that you're doing in planting a church differently. And that's really our goal. Talked about the other layers just quickly. Oh, did you have a question?
You said there were 5?
Yes.
And yet I only caught 4.
Oh, thank you. Yes, well, the last one is landmarks. Well, thank you. Thank you. Landmarks are, I know you think when you hear the word landmarks, you think of like the Statue of Liberty or Eiffel Tower or something, and those are landmarks. But landmarks in mapping are those significant things that people use to navigate the city. Usually they're physical structures. They can be natural or man-made, right? So in Portland, to the east of us is Mount Hood. And you can see it for miles. It's this huge volcanic mountain, snow-covered year-round. It's beautiful. Everybody knows the mountain is east. So they travel in the city according to that. They give directions according to that. They say, go east. Go towards Mount Hood. That's how you know you're going east. That's how you get to my house, go to Mount Hood. Go toward Mount Hood. So they use that to navigate the city. Those are super significant for us in church planting because we sometimes try to give directions according to maybe street names or addresses. But if people don't know what that is, they don't know how to find you. So find the landmark. Say, we're really close to the Walmart, if that's a landmark in your neighborhood. This is where people know, that's that location, around that neighborhood. That helps people navigate the city and find you and know who you are and where you are. So landmarks is the fifth one. Yes, sir?
Do districts have subdivisions, like sections?
They do. They have neighborhoods. They have definitely sub-districts. Those tend to be a little bit less important in terms of your identity. So people will say, if you live in a city, according to Lynch, if this is a neighborhood and this is another neighborhood, but they are a district. The district is what gives them their sameness. So these two neighborhoods have very little, have very much in common. But up here is a different district. Different neighborhood too, but a different district. They have less in common, even though proximity is the same. So in Portland, this whole area would be one district, North Portland. And it's kind of just a wedge of the city, right? And it's North Portland. And we have our identity there. Where do you live? North Portland. People who've been in North Portland for a while roll their eyes, because that's a rough neighborhood, or it was 5-10 years ago. We don't have a problem with it. We find it to be quite nice. But that's new. So people who've been in Portland for a while are like, ooh, you live in North Portland. It has that sameness, that sense of it's not a safe, not a good neighborhood. You don't stop mapping once you've figured out your neighborhood, because your neighborhoods never change. Your city never changes, or it stops changing. Sorry. Your city never stops changing. And so for you to say, yeah, we've got our map, we're good, we figured it out. Well, just wait. What we found in Portland is gentrification started in the center of town where housing prices were depressed and all the cool hipsters moved in and opened coffee shops and art galleries. Then everybody started moving there. And so the undesirable properties started to become desirable. And now gentrification is happening like this. So what happens is lower income families, especially those who rent, can't afford to live in the neighborhood anymore. They've got to move farther out. And all the young middle class suburbanites looking for adventure are moving into the city. Every weekend we see moving trucks in our neighborhood. Gentrification is happening around us. We see businesses that are mom and pop shops shut down and turned into a local chain, for example. So that's happening all the time. So your map is constantly changing. It's sort of a living document. Should we do a practice of the map?
Yeah, if you want to, go ahead.
Let's do that. So if you have a piece of paper, or you're going to take notes, try this really quick. I know we don't want to take too much time on this, but sketch me a map of your city. Now, I've never been to your city. I may have, but pretend I've never been to your city, and I just want to get familiar with, just familiarize me with your city. Just draw a quick sketch of your city.
We also recommend it's a good exercise with your core leadership team to be able to do this sort of thing. They can be able to introduce this and have them kind of draw and get everybody's perspective individually, and then get together and talk about it, because you'll be able to find out different things about your city or neighborhood from different perspectives, and then it kind of collaborative learning.
The beauty of having a physical map that you've put together is now when somebody new comes to join your ministry, you can quickly bring them up to speed, give them a sort of a foundational education about what your city's like with the map. So here's a map. Study it, learn it, add to it. It also gives somebody something concrete to do the first few days when they arrive, first few months even. They first come to join your ministry. We're here to plant the church. We want to help you. What do? Start walking the neighborhood. Start compiling the map. Tell us where the nodes, where the paths, right? Districts, edges, landmarks. Okay. Real quick, some questions.
Yeah.
Is your map oriented north-south? Is north up on your map?
Yeah.
Okay, interesting. And is your map roughly to scale, would you say? Not at all.
No, I'm not that.
I ask those things because neither of those things is important. When you start to draw a map, for some reason we get into like map maker mode, and we think north has to be up and everything has to be distanced according to reality. That's really insignificant. When you're mapping, you want it to reflect how people view the city. I lived in Barcelona, and the city was laid out in a perfect grid. Thank you for sharing. But not in a north-south orientation, right? So it would be silly for me to draw all my maps and think of the city in terms of north-south when it's not navigated or settled that way, right? Does that make any sense? So again, we're trying to show a map. The geography is important. The distances are important. But the most important thing is we're trying to get an idea, put ourselves in the shoes of the people that we're ministering to. Yes, sir?
You map a town of 10,000. Is that too small? Is there a size for what you just don't map?
No. I don't think there's ever a city too small.
Because you probably have, 10,000 in that area, part of North Portland, or less?
Yeah, probably in our area, in our neighborhood. So I would say there's no neighborhood too small or no city too small, and the reason is because it helps to be aware of how the people see the city. To a town of 10,000 people may be like a big time for somebody who's moved in from the country and didn't see a neighbor, right? And so for them, again, you're trying to put yourself in their shoes. So that's the first layer. I want to buzz through the second two layers because we have other things to talk about. The first layer of mapping, and so you've done that. You've just now put down the geographic locations of some major things. Hopefully you have some paths, some nodes, some districts and their edges, and then a few landmarks that people use to navigate the city, right? So that's your map. That's one layer. Now if we could put on top of that the social layer. And when you guys plant churches, most of you know you kind of do some demographic research. You can actually buy it. Some of you have organizations that you work with that help get you demographic research. Demographics simply show who lives where. And that's good. Be careful of statistics like Census Bureau statistics, because a lot of people lie on those. The numbers that you'll see are probably not honest. Will be the ones about immigration, right? About immigrant groups. There's just a huge incentive on the part of immigrant groups to lie about how many people live in their home, right? So you go into an apartment complex, and there's one apartment. You knock on the door, and somebody opened the door. You say, "How many people live here?" And they'll say, 2. And what they really mean is the 2 of us plus our 12 family members, an extended family. We all live in this tiny apartment, right? So you've got to walk the streets to get to know who lives where. But as you do that, you can start to say, oh, I didn't notice there's a pocket of people that are a different, maybe an ethno-linguistic people group that live in this neighborhood. Poverty is really, really concentrated in this part of town. I didn't know that. And the affluent, they all live up here on the hillside. Your map should reflect that, okay? So again, all those different people and some of their stories. Because you have people who live in a city that don't have a common experience. There are some people that enjoy a comfortable life in the city. There are people who are struggling to make it day to day in your city. Those stories should be reflected on your map. Again, we're church planters. We're not trying to just get the lay of the land. We're trying to get, okay, God's heart for these people. Who lives here? What is this like? What are our realities that we're dealing with? A foreign missionary, international missionary, does this. You as church planters, we as church planters, we need to be doing this. The last layer is The last layer would be the spiritual layer, right? And so at the spiritual layer, that's where it's really, really subjective. It's really hard to come up with. Don't take somebody else's statistics for this, but instead plot on your map really good conversations that you have. When you see somebody come to faith, mark it on your map. There's something significant about where that person lives. Now you know the kingdom is being born in this household, right? So don't just say, well, I had this. Maybe it's a place of work, a place of business. Maybe it's a school situation, a marketplace, something like that. But your map, the spiritual layer of your map, and this is probably also the most sensitive. Sometimes it's just a question of, man, there's nothing in this whole. It's like the black hole of our neighborhood. In my neighborhood, there are churches along this interstate section, but as you go over here, I say churches, there are church buildings in this section, but there are no churches over here. Why is that? I had no idea, but then I found out it's not for lack of trying. People have been trying to plant churches in this part of the neighborhood for years, and nothing ever came of it. I don't know what that means, but I'm going to put that on my map. This is like a no church zone. Does that make any sense? Things of spiritual significance. Other churches would be great to plot on this layer of your map. Other religions. If there's a Buddhist temple, if there's a mosque, a prayer room, right? Anything else that's in your neighborhood, just be aware. Anything on the spiritual level. Now you've got a guide that you can give to somebody when they want to go pray for your city. Go to this neighborhood and take this map and pray over every section, everything that we've plotted on this map, every pin that we've dropped on this map. Tremendous resource. They can pray with insight instead of just walking around praying blindly. Does that make any sense?